Oh, can you hear me? Looks like I am having a little bit of technical difficulties, so sorry about that. Welcome. Thank you for joining me here on this webinar today. My name is Maus Goran, and I am a program associate for Green Energy Consumers Alliance. I work mostly on Green Energy Consumers Drive Green program, which is an electric vehicle discount program and a resource for consumers to learn more about electric cars. So I'm very excited that you could all join me here this afternoon. So normally during the summertime and throughout most of the spring and fall, Green Energy Consumers Alliance works on trying to put together electric vehicle events so that people can come together, see electric cars, test drive them, and talk to real electric car drivers. But because of the limitations imposed by COVID-19, we obviously, can't be gathering in large groups of people. And so I'm hoping that this webinar will be able to be the beginning of a conversation, and at some point we'll all be able to, meet in person and have those experiences again. But for the time being, I'm really glad that you could all join me for this webinar. And I'm particularly excited because maintenance is a topic that is not discussed as much for those considering an electric car. So I'm excited to be talking about that today. First, I will be just going over a couple of logistics. Everyone is muted to avoid background noise, but there will be plenty of opportunities to be asking questions. You can send those questions to me via the questions box that you see on your screen, and I will take a break in the middle of this presentation and then a long break at the end to answer any questions that you all have about the information that I present here. So let's get started. If you haven't heard of Green Energy Consumers Alliance before, we're a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to harness our power as energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. And Drive Green helps us accomplish that mission by getting electric cars on the road in place of gasoline powered cars. We also have plenty of other programs to make green energy more accessible to consumers. And also we advocate for good policy changes on the state level in order to speed that transition. And electric cars are just one piece of all the work that we do. So if you haven't heard about us before, if you're new to our organization, I encourage you to learn more about all the other initiatives that we have going on our website, which is greenenergyconsumers.org. But today I will be talking about electric cars. And you might already know there are many benefits to switching to an electric car that I believe make them a superior technology to gas-powered cars for a lot of reasons. The first and most obvious is the impact to the climate. So the environmental benefits of electric cars are probably one of the biggest reasons that people decide to switch to one. And the motivation for that is clear. Electric cars reduce climate warming emissions by about 75% on a per mile basis. And so, there's really no pathway to a low carbon future without electric vehicles on the road. The second benefit is, the impact on air quality. So I think a lot of people have had air quality on the mind recently because fewer gas-powered cars on the road over the last couple of months has vastly improved air quality all over the country and the world. And we've seen that particularly in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, where Green Energy Consumers Alliance does the majority of its advocacy and program work. So with more electric cars, we'll have that benefit to air quality as well, since they don't have tailpipes and they don't have the particulate emissions that diminish air quality. The third reason that a lot of people enjoy the switch to their electric cars is lower fuel costs. Electricity is much cheaper than gasoline. Even with the very low gas prices that we're seeing right now, electricity is very competitive. And you also see that there's less fluctuation with electricity prices than with gasoline prices. So what that means is that consumers can expect to save money in the long term, even with the constant changing of gas prices. So that's great for folks who want to decrease their cost to own a car. And of course, these vehicles are very fun to drive. They have great acceleration, they're quiet, they handle really well. And if you haven't gotten the wheel or behind the wheel of one of these vehicles before, then I encourage you to do so when you feel comfortable, because they really are quite a fun ride. And the fifth reason I have there is the focus for today. Maintenance is usually not the #1 reason as to why anyone switches to an electric car, but I believe it's worth taking the time to dive into this a little bit more because the benefits are underappreciated. So that's what I'll be doing today. And of course, you can learn all about the different reasons that I've listed out here more on the Green Energy Consumers website on the Drive Green page. So I want to start out by just explaining a little bit how electric vehicles actually work, because they're a new technology. So there is often this presumption that they are harder to understand than the technologies that they're replacing, which is gas-powered cars. But the reality is that electric motors are much simpler machines than gas engines. Many people understand that there is a lithium-ion battery in an electric vehicle. And so as energy is flowing from that battery, that induces a magnetic field. And so there's a magnet in the electric motor. And so as more electricity flows out of the battery, the magnet responds to that greater magnetic field that is created. So it starts to rotate. That's connected directly to the wheels of the vehicle. And so that's what causes the car to move. It's a pretty simple system. There's just about 20 moving parts in the powertrain. And when your foot is off the accelerator, there is no electricity running and there's no idling or wasting of energy. So basically, the more you press on the pedal, the faster the car goes. And that is pretty much all there is to it when it comes to an electric car. On the other hand, if you're driving a combustion engine car now, it's likely that you don't know very much about how the engine works. And part of the reason for that is that they're pretty dang complicated. So basically what's happening in a combustion engine is that there is a controlled explosion of fuel and air, and that's what's driving a piston up and down. That piston is attached to a transmission, which controls how fast the vehicle is driving. And then that's attached to a drive shaft that allows the wheels of the car to rotate. So I'm not sure if you can see the animation moving there, but there are 4 different steps to this process, and each component of that process requires all sorts of moving parts. So you need to have fuel and air lines in order to make sure that you have the right ratio in the fuel mix. You have a starter motor and a spark plug and ignition coil to get everything up and running, just to get the car started. And you also need a transmission and a way to control the car's speed, because just running this process faster won't actually make the car go faster. And so in a combustion engine vehicle, there are as many as 400 moving parts in the engine. So it's very complicated. There is a lot going on. And, and one of the worst things about combustion engines is that the byproducts of combustion are pretty nasty. So you have carbon monoxide and soot and other pollutants that are coming out of that tailpipe. And so you need additional parts to clean up that exhaust. And then even when you clean up the actual poison that is coming out of the tailpipe, you're still getting those climate warming emissions and small particulate matter that contributes to asthma and other public health problems. And so there's really just no getting around a lot of the problems that combustion engines have. And this is a technology that's been around for 150 years, and it just doesn't look like it's getting much better. And those 400 moving parts aren't just complex. They require regular servicing. So here is the maintenance schedule for a 2020 Chevy Sonic, which is a car on the smallish side. And so this will, give you a sense of how often you need to take your car in for regular service. So if you start reading this list, you'll notice that a lot of these things are maintenance that is needed because of the complexity of combustion engines, and there's just a lot that can go wrong. So if you have fewer parts, there's less that needs to be maintained, and that's less for you to worry about as a consumer who's driving a car. So there's no oil to change. You don't need to check any engine air filters. You don't have spark plugs. Those are pretty much half the list is eliminated in an electric vehicle because they just don't have those parts. So you might be wondering, those parts don't exist in an electric car, but surely there are other things that need to be maintained in the vehicle. And the answer there is no. So here you can see the service schedule for the 2020 Chevy Bolt, which is a pretty similar size to the Chevy Sonic. And you see the maintenance schedule list is half as long, and it doesn't have anything special because the vehicle is electric. And I'll say even the brake pads in an electric vehicle last longer. And that's because of the braking systems that electric cars use to improve their efficiency. You might be familiar with a system called regenerative braking, which became popular because of its use in the Toyota Prius hybrid, which was, the eco-friendly car of its day about 10 years ago. But in a regular car, brake pads use friction to stop the car's movement. And so that friction wears down the brake pads over time. When you're driving a car with a battery, pressing on the brake pedal slows the car down, and it actually redirects that energy away from friction and the heat losses in order to be stored in the battery to be used again. And so that's called regenerative braking, and it allows the car to capture energy that is usually wasted in those gas-powered cars. So because those brake pads aren't being exposed to as much friction or heat, they're lasting longer. And so you actually see that in the maintenance schedule as well. Now, drivers buy electric vehicles for a lot of reasons. You might be interested in the fact that they're better for the climate. You might think that the driving and owning experience of an electric vehicle is better, but it's becoming apparent that the ease of maintenance is really sweetening the deal for a lot of drivers. So Claude here, whose quote is shown up on the screen, is a real EV driver who got his Nissan Leaf through Drive Green when the program had just started back in 2016. And so you see on top of the ease of maintenance that we see comparing those maintenance schedules, there's just not a whole lot that needs to be done into these cars to keep them working the way that they're supposed to be. And I'll mention that pretty much all vehicles are plugged into a computer when you bring them in for servicing, just so that mechanics can see if there's anything that's wrong with the car's computer, and so that they can basically get an update as to what the car's status is. So this is the bare minimum for what kind of maintenance a car would need, and it's a really common experience for electric vehicle drivers to only have to rotate their tires and plug it into the computer every so often. And so easy maintenance isn't just a technical benefit. Less maintenance requirements translates to actual time and money saved at the service stop. Each oil change might only cost $30 and an hour and a half of your time, but over a long period of time, we see that adds up to a lot of savings for drivers. So AAA did a survey of drivers and actually put a number on those maintenance savings. So they found that the average gas-powered car driver will pay about 8.94 cents per mile for maintenance and repair if they're driving a sedan. And then that number is a little bit higher if you're driving a bigger SUV. It's about 9.9 cents for every mile that you drive. But when you look at electric car drivers, that drops down to about 6.6 cents per mile. So what that translates to is for the first 5 years of driving, assuming that you're driving about 15,000 miles a year and 75,000 miles total, you'll save as much as $1,800 because of that switch to an electric car. And again, that is not counting the time that you're saving as well. So if you don't have a lot of time, then the electric car will benefit you there as well. However, even AAA's numbers might be a little conservative based off of the numbers that other people are putting out in terms of their real life experience. And some drivers are saving much more than that. So here we have some data from the city of New York, which is slowly adding electric vehicles into its fleet for public use vehicles. So vehicles that, city employees might be driving around for parking enforcement and other low-duty tasks. And so this is the first analysis of its kind. It was published in March 2019, so it's less than a year old. And so you can see when you actually are comparing these vehicles, the all-electric vehicles are providing substantial savings over the similarly sized gas-powered cars. And so when you compare these similar cars, it can be as much as $900 in savings in just 1 year of driving. So that is particularly beneficial, for fleet managers. They're managing a lot of vehicles, and so this can end up saving a lot of money. But you'll see similar savings for just one-car households as well. And as more electric models come out, I anticipate that we'll be able to do some heavy-duty comparisons as well. And so since heavy-duty vehicles like SUVs that we saw earlier tend to have higher maintenance costs, the savings of switching to an electric car may be even greater. So I'll be really curious to see how that develops as those models come out. And I'll also note that we have all electric cars showing the most amount of savings, and then gas-powered cars, which are quite expensive to maintain. And then there's that middle ground there where we see hybrid plug-ins. Those are vehicles that have both an electric motor and a gas-powered engine. So the idea is that they can drive some amount of miles on the electric motor, and then at one point, once you run out of juice, you will switch over to the combustion engine. So they're a hybrid of both technologies. And so even though these plug-in hybrids do have a gasoline engine to maintain, the driver is often driving at least a portion of their miles on the electric motor. Some people will be driving more, some people will be driving less. But in any case, that takes the load off of the combustion engine, and so it still requires less maintenance than a conventional gas-powered car. And it also decreases the likelihood of costly repairs as well. So while you still have to do things like regular oil changes and inspections, even going with the plug-in hybrid shows significant cost savings, and it also requires less frequent maintenance. And I know this from personal experience as well. I drive a plug-in hybrid, and it has been quite easy to maintain. I actually just changed my oil for the first time a couple of weeks ago, and the car has about 30,000 miles on it. So easy maintenance makes electric cars good for consumers, but it also fits into this larger picture that electric cars, despite higher sticker prices, are a sound financial decision when you take into account all the incentives that are actually available. So this chart shows a comparison, again, between two similarly sized cars in order to have a sound comparison. We have the Hyundai Kona EV and the Toyota RAV4. And before I actually dive into this chart, I do want to say that Toyota is releasing a plug-in hybrid version of the RAV4. It'll be called the RAV4 Prime, and I believe it's slated to come out either later this year or early next year, depending on the extent of coronavirus-related delays. So pretty soon we'll see a comparison of, pretty much the same exact car as well. But, otherwise they're pretty similarly sized cars here. So the sticker price, if you're first looking at the Hyundai Kona EV, it's about $10,000 more than the Toyota RAV4, which if you're just looking at that would seem like it's totally out of your budget. But when you take into account all of the incentives that are available, including the Drive Green discount, which is often offered on a monthly basis on this vehicle, and then the $2,500 more EV Massachusetts state rebate if you're living in Massachusetts and you're eligible for that, and then as well as the $7,500 federal tax credit on electric vehicles, the actual price that you're paying for the car is quite similar to the Toyota RAV4. So even from the get-go, the comparison is pretty good. But then as you look at fuel costs, the Hyundai Kona is much more efficient and it costs less to fuel, assuming 15,000 miles are driven in a year than the Toyota RAV4. And then finally, once you dive into the repair costs, the RAV4 has that higher rate because it is an SUV-sized car compared to the Hyundai Kona, which is, cheaper to maintain than a gas-powered sedan, even though it is a larger car. You see that those savings really pile up. And so the cost of maintenance really kind of ensures that this is a good, sound financial decision for a lot of people. And so if you are kind of wondering if an electric vehicle is right for you, it is worth sitting down to do the math because it often shows that the cost of ownership makes it worth it for the consumer in the end. So I will take a quick break for questions because I know I've gone through quite a bit of information here. And if you're still kind of processing, then, I'll definitely have plenty of time for questions at the end, so don't feel like you have to send in all your questions now, but I do see we're getting a few in. Someone asks if there is any difference of maintenance between different models and car companies, or is this an irrelevant question? So overall, we see that most electric vehicles require very little maintenance, and it has to do with that underlying technology. There's just not a whole lot that the electric motor propulsion system needs to have maintained. So you don't really see a whole lot of difference. Some automakers will advertise it more, others will advertise it less, but you can rest assured that all of the electric vehicles that you see on the market require very low levels of maintenance. But that's a great question. Yes. So someone is pointing out that the RAV4 Prime is already in short supply, even though it hasn't been released yet. And that is a great point. So I think, the media a lot of times makes it seem like consumers don't want electric cars. And so that's why there are few of them on the road. But in certain regions, I think specifically the Massachusetts and greater Boston area is showing a very high demand for electric cars. And so, in these regions, you actually see fewer cars than people are demanding. And so it probably will be hard to get your hands on a RAV4 Prime as soon as it gets released, particularly the fact that it's an SUV size. And so that tends to be more popular with consumers. But again, more of these vehicles will be coming out in the short term and in the long term as well. So if you can't get the vehicle that you have your eye on, then there are more options coming very quickly. Someone's asking whether I'll provide a copy of the slides to participants. I absolutely will after the webinar is ended, and I'll also be sharing a recording as well. Someone's asking whether all-wheel drive vehicles add to the maintenance issues that are required over time. So there aren't many all-wheel drive options for electric vehicles because all-wheel drive greatly cuts into the efficiency of electric cars because they require more power. And so usually, what that translates to is an all-wheel drive gasoline-powered car has lower MPG. In an electric car, that's more of an issue because automakers want to make sure that these vehicles have appropriate and useful range. So we don't see a ton of all-wheel drive vehicles yet, but I don't anticipate that that will add to the maintenance issues over time. I do think that those vehicles will require larger batteries in order to support that highly energy-intensive feature. And in fact, I think Tesla has a couple of all-wheel drive options, but they also have larger and more expensive batteries as well. So you kind of see that trade-off, and I think that there will be more options for that in the future as well. Okay, I do see some more questions, but a few of them I will answer in the coming slides, so I'm going to put them on hold just for now. But I see plenty of great ones, and feel free to keep them coming. And again, I will have some time at the end to answer the rest of those questions that I see. In the first 5 years of its life, a gas-powered car is relatively reliable, especially if you are following the maintenance schedule. So if you're getting your oil changed regularly, if you're rotating your tires, you're not going to have very many problems. And so an electric car driver, if you're making that switch to an electric car, you'll probably be saving $20 to $55 for each oil change and service stop, depending on the car that you're switching from. And it is important to get regular maintenance because it does help prevent unnecessary repairs and it prevents future issues. But as cars age, they become more unreliable. So that means on top of the regular maintenance costs that you might incur, repairs are often unexpected and a very costly expense for drivers when they are driving older vehicles. Meanwhile, electric cars continue to be hassle-free in the long term. So while a gas-powered car might increasingly need repairs as it ages, we don't see that kind of degradation with electric vehicles. So over the life of the car, you can expect to save as much as $3,500 in maintenance and repair, the majority of which is repair costs. So the longer you plan on driving a car, the more advantageous it is to be going electric. And it's also particularly advantageous if you're buying a car pre-owned and you don't really know what its previous history was like. This might make sense to you already because maintenance and repair are pretty closely related, but maintenance is scheduled and regular, so you can kind of plan for it and you have a good expectation of what it's going to be like, whereas repairs are unwelcome surprises. And so I actually took a look at the 30 or so most common car problems, and I found that 2/3 of them are issues that only can happen to a combustion engine vehicle. So we see here examples of having issues with your catalytic converter, or perhaps you have clogged filters for the fuel or air. Maybe your engine is overheating or it's sputtering. These are problems that are largely limited to the combustion engine. Of course, there's some overlap between combustion engine cars and electric vehicles because they both have tires, they might have power window or door issues. They're both cars that are mechanically operated, and you might have some sort of cosmetic issues or issues with the AC, which will happen, because all cars have air conditioning. But you really just see much less that can go wrong with the electric vehicle. There's not a whole lot that can go wrong. And in fact, the only thing that you will have to think about as you drive an electric car until it ages is the fact that lithium-ion batteries degrade over time. And even that is a very manageable issue compared to a lot of the unexpected car problems that can happen if you're driving a combustion engine car. And I will talk about that in a couple of slides. And I do want to just emphasize this fact because maintenance is annoying, but car repairs are very stressful and often overburden folks who cannot afford to be driving newer or better maintained cars. So an unexpected car repair is usually about between $500 and $600, and the older the car is, the more money that you'll have to sink into it. And this is a burden, particularly for low and moderate income buyers who are stuck with older cars that need more frequent repairs. And quite frankly, from the position of a consumer, it really stinks to not be able to rely on your car for a long period of time. And so with the high reliability of electric vehicles, drivers will likely be able to go far beyond between the 150,000 miles that we expect of gas cars today. So that means not only are you less likely to have to need a costly repair, but that high reliability ensures that these cars will be driven for much longer. And so low and moderate income consumers will be able to buy pre-owned vehicles which have a lot of miles on them and not have to be burdened by unexpected car repairs. And this benefit also exists if you are the type of person that buys a new car and then drives it until it's totally dead. So you'll be able to actually drive that electric vehicle for much longer than you would a comparable gas-powered car. And the reason for that is even though electric vehicle batteries degrade over time, the technology is quite advanced and you don't lose that much capacity over time. So lithium-ion battery degradation is a natural process. You've probably noticed it with your cell phones or laptops. As a device ages, it just doesn't hold as good of a charge as it used to. And that is something that will always be a factor. However, electric cars have much larger batteries, and they also have more advanced battery management systems. So that means these batteries are less likely to overheat, they're less likely to be overcharged, and they are more likely to last for the years and years of high-duty use that drivers need to expect of their vehicles. I know personally I've had a problem with, my cell phone battery, and you typically have to get rid of your cell phone when that battery just won't support you anymore, but we don't see that behavior with electric vehicles, and the data shows that. So you can see on the graph there, I had 2017 models of 3 of the most popular electric vehicles in the US, the Chevy Bolt, the Model S, and the Nissan Leaf. And we see that they all have pretty comparable rates of battery degradation. It's about a 4% loss over the 3 or so years that they've been on the road. The gray line there is an average for all electric vehicles since the first ones came out way back in 2012. The good news is that you see that improvement has already been happening over the last couple years. So cars released in 2017 are doing better than the aggregate of the cars that were released up until then. and we'll see that that improvement continues. So as technology gets better, people can expect that the batteries hold up over time and they do better than the cars being released from previous years. And so what does that mean in a practical sense for a driver? What does 4% range loss look like if you are a 2017 Chevy Bolt driver and you see that over 3 years? I guess the first thing that I want to clarify is that the stated range that is given when you buy the vehicle, in the case of the Chevy Bolt, it's 238 miles. That is just an estimate. And so that's assuming that you're driving about 60% of your miles in the city, about 40% of your miles on the highway. It doesn't take into account the slight variations of, terrain, of temperature, and all those other things that affect your actual range. And so even 238 miles on a full charge is not exactly what most people will be experiencing. Some folks might be getting a little more than that on a full charge. If you're driving in the cold uphill, you might get a little less than that. So even that 238 number is just an estimate. But then if you look at 4%, that would translate to a full range of 229 miles, which is a very small difference. And again, because the driving conditions affect what your actual range will be, it's not very noticeable for the average driver. So this is just kind of like a theoretical that we see over standardized conditions. But this kind of performance is, it certainly beats my cell phone and my computer. But we see that this is consistent and it's something that you can plan around for. So if you know that you lose about 2% of range per year, that'll be quite a long time until you significantly diminish your actual driving range, at which point, you can always trade your car in to get a newer model with more range, or, you can decide like, I really need at least 200 miles. Once the car loses more range than that, then you can make that calculated decision to start thinking about getting a new car. But that would take, 10 years or so anyway. So unlike an unexpected car repair, which suddenly takes your car out of commission, range loss is something that you can monitor over time. It's something that you can expect and plan around. I'm giving you this information, and I do just want to make it clear that this is a major concern for consumers, because you obviously don't want to invest money in a car that is, not going to be as easy as you think, or that gives you problems. And so car makers understand that this is an area of concern for most drivers, and the warranties that are provided with electric cars that are sold now will cover you if something goes wrong in the battery. So it's unlikely that this will happen, but sometimes, manufacturing errors happen, and you get a battery that does not have the performance that you would be expecting. So most automakers, if not all of them, I think it actually might be a law that they need to have some sort of coverage on the lithium-ion battery, but most of that coverage extends for 8 years or 100,000 miles, which is plenty of time for something to go wrong if the battery has some sort of factory malfunction. And then we also see the percentage guarantee there. So what that means is that if you're driving the Nissan Leaf and it loses more than 30% of its original storage capacity in that battery before you drive 100,000 miles, they'll replace the battery totally free of charge to you. And there have been a couple of drivers who, I think there was one I know who has a Nissan Leaf where this happened. There was an issue with the battery, and they replaced it without a problem. It didn't take very long at all. And he's extremely pleased with the performance that the car has had since then. So there is this kind of sense of security. If you are feeling a little bit nervous about the technology, you will be covered. And I also do want to say that most auto manufacturers automatically transfer the battery warranty to a second-hand owner. So if you buy the car pre-owned, you'll be covered if something goes wrong with the battery as well. But you should always read the fine print of the warranty just so that you understand what exactly is covered, because you do see some variation in the percentage guaranteed there. But again, automakers are extremely confident in this technology. It's improving very quickly, and we're seeing some pretty bold claims from some of the two most popular electric vehicle producers in the country. So not long ago, this article is from May 14th, Tesla announced that it is close to preparing a 1,000,000-mile battery that could greatly lower the cost of its vehicles. So what that means is they're so confident in their technology and the lifetime of the battery that they think that their vehicles could last 1,000,000 miles on the road. And then not long after that, General Motors, which produces Chevrolet, Cadillac, GMC, and some other makes of vehicles, says that it's almost there on the 1,000,000-mile battery as well. So this is pretty impressive. You don't see very many combustion engine cars that can last 1,000,000 miles. And even though the electric vehicle industry is still pretty new, we see this very impressive performance, and we're right on the cusp of that. You know, and this is news, it's press releases. I do want to present some level of skepticism because it's unclear when exactly this will happen. And automakers claim that they've made breakthroughs all the time. But it is promising that there are two of them that are willing to make this claim. And so this is good news, not only for consumers who are buying new electric cars, but also it's good news for all the people that will be interested in pre-owned vehicles once they're available. And to wrap up, I just wanted to give you a couple of battery care tips for folks that are already driving electric vehicles, because even though battery degradation is a natural process, there are some things that you can do in order to slow it down and ensure that you're getting the best long-term performance out of your car as possible. The first tip I have is to try and plug in and recharge before your charge level drops down to below 20%. Data shows that most electric vehicle drivers learn to do this anyway because you want to keep your car charged up and ready to go. And since most people charge at home, it's pretty easy to just plug in once you come home after a day at work, or in this case, if you're coming back from the grocery store or some other socially distant activity. And so I believe it's most common that people are plugging in when their battery is at around 40%, but making sure that it doesn't drop down too low is always a good idea. The second tip is to plan ahead for long-term storage, and you really want to avoid leaving your EV parked at 100% for many days at a time. So this is particularly relevant now that people are driving a little bit less. But if you're not going to be using your EV, then you should probably charge it to 50% and leave it unplugged if you can. I know depending on the circumstance, so for example, if you're driving to the airport and leaving your car there for a couple of weeks as you're traveling, it might not always be possible. And I do know that Tesla recommends that you actually keep your car plugged in if you can. So if you already own an electric vehicle, you might want to look more into that if you're going to be leaving your car long term. But leaving it charged at 50% is the best way to go. The third tip is to try and save DC fast charging for long road trips or emergencies only. And the reason for that is that DC fast charging is really high power. It introduces a lot of heat into the battery, and heat is not a battery's friend at all. You want to try to avoid not overheating your battery. And so the more you rely on DC fast charging, the worse off your battery will be long term. So saving it for long road trips or emergencies is the best course of action. And then finally, you want to, for that same reason, you want to be mindful of the weather and park in the shade on extremely hot days if you can. reason being that you don't want to expose your battery to unnecessary heat. And again, there are circumstances where this isn't always possible. So if you're going to the beach and the parking lot doesn't have a tree in sight, and you leave your car in the sun because you don't have another choice, that's okay. But just trying to follow these tips as closely as you can limit your battery degradation rate to less than 2%, which is the average for a yearly basis, and give your car as much life as possible. But of course, you know, the automakers are really confident in their technology, and they are saying that these batteries will last 1 million miles. And so perhaps someday DC fast charging, you could do it every day and not have it be an issue. And I do want to acknowledge that the technology is changing very quickly. But these are some vetted tips from EV drivers and experts who claim that these tips work. That is the end of my presentation. I definitely see some questions coming in, so I'm looking forward to answering those. And if, again, you're still kind of processing this information, I'm available by email to talk more and answer questions that come in after the end of today's webinar. Let's see what kind of questions people have. We have a question about solar panels and how do you access that power for an electric vehicle? So good question. Electric vehicles will use whatever electricity is coming from the outlet when you plug it in. So if you either just use the charging cable that comes with the car, or if you invest in a level 2 charger that will charge your car at a faster rate, that requires either 110 or a 240 volt outlet, depending on the level that you're charging at. And so if your solar panels are producing electricity and you plug your car in, then you'll be using that electricity. If you plug in at nighttime, then your solar panels aren't producing electricity, and so you won't be charging with that energy. But definitely solar panels and electric vehicles kind of go hand in hand. But you can think of an electric vehicle as any other household appliance that you would use. And just to clarify on what I just said, yes, you can plug an electric vehicle into a regular outlet in your garage. That is how I charge my electric vehicle. It doesn't give you a lot of range per hour. I think the average is about 4 miles of range per hour of charging. And so it's really best for if you don't drive a lot, or if you leave your car parked overnight or during the day very often, but you can charge it using a regular outlet. The other option would be to have an electrician come in and install a 240 volt outlet, which is something that is used for higher power appliances like a washer or dryer. And then once you do that, you can buy a what's called level 2 charging station and then plug that into that outlet, and you can charge as much as 25 miles of range per hour. So that makes it significantly faster and gives most people a full charge if they're charging 8 hours overnight. So both of those options are the best one for you. Depends on what your driving habits are like, but you can find more information about that on the Green Energy Consumers website under our charging page. Why isn't it a good idea to leave a car with 100% charge? Good question. So the reason that you don't want to do that is because in a lithium-ion battery, when you're charging, you have lithium ions that are moving from the negative side of the battery to the positive side of the battery. And so when you're at 100% charge, if you could visualize this, you have all of your lithium ions on one side of the battery. And that's like a very high energy position. It takes a lot of energy to get them all in there. And so over time, what happens is those other, some of those lithium ions start to creep over to the other side of the battery. And so that causes capacity loss over time. So you might notice this with your computer if you fully charge it and then come back to it in a couple of weeks without touching it. It's not at the charge level that you left it at because lithium ion batteries are not good at holding at 100% charge. And so in addition to coming back to a device that's not at the charge level that you left it, it just is not good for the actual chemical composition of the battery is the best way I can describe it. But it just is not great for its long-term health. If you're interested, I can send more information about that in the follow-up, but it requires just a bit of a higher level understanding of some chemistry, which some people are not always a fan of, but I can send more information about that. Do Teslas only have fast charging? Good question. Tesla probably has the most expansive network of fast charging infrastructure. So you might see those Tesla superchargers on the highway near gas stations or you know, in parking lots and grocery stores and things like that. And they've done a really good job of building up that infrastructure for Tesla drivers. But pretty much all fully electric vehicles are able to fast charge. Some vehicles, for example, the 2017 Chevy Bolt, fast charging capability is an additional option that you have to purchase with your vehicle. But for the most part, most vehicles that are coming out now do have fast charging as an option. And the infrastructure is a little less built out, but it's improving really quickly. And, you know, it is a really important option, I think, for anyone who does any amount of long distance driving, or if you just want to be prepared in case of an emergency, it can cut down charging time significantly. So the answer is most electric vehicles have fast charging, but you do want to make sure if you're planning on buying one that it has the option for you to be able to do that. And again, there is some more information about that on Green Energy Consumers Charging page because there are two different fast charging ports that are used depending on where the vehicle is produced. So you can find more information about that there. Will there be more battery degradation issues for those without easy home charging? So I think that depends really on the amount of fast charging that you're doing. If you don't have access to charging at home, and so instead you have to rely on quickly stopping at a DC fast charger as you're going about your day, then you probably will see a faster rate of degradation just because DC fast charging is more heat intensive and can do some more longer term damage. But you know, for folks that are charging at level 2 charging stations at work, I've seen a lot of level 2 charging stations around the city of Boston and other urban areas around there as well. If you're charging at those level 2 stations, you won't experience any faster rate of degradation than someone charging at home. I think folks charging at home tend to have the option to charge a little bit more slowly because their car is parked in one place for a longer period of time. But I haven't seen any data that suggests that folks that charge out and about tend to have faster rates of degradation. Do you think you'll be able to replace the battery in an EV after it declines significantly? This is an area that Green Energy Consumers Alliance is following very closely, mostly because the market for what a second life will look like for used electric vehicles is still not really developing, because most of those batteries are still being used in the vehicles themselves. So this question will probably be answered 5 or 10 years down the road when we have a lot of electric vehicles that have lived their first full lives as electric vehicles. But I can see a couple of things playing out. The first thing that might happen is, so batteries are considered significantly decline, or their health is significantly declined when they've lost about 20% of their original storage capacity. But 80% of a 60 kilowatt hour battery is still quite a lot of storage. I think I've done the math on this. It's the same amount of storage that would be used to produce like 10,000 smartphones. So it's a lot of battery power. And so there may be a market that pops up for grid operators to take those used batteries and use them as electricity storage for the grid. There may be a market for people to take those used batteries and hook them up to the storage for storage for their home if they have solar panels, so that they can have backup power in the case of an emergency. And so that really depends, but to be honest, I'm not sure if battery replacement will be in the cards, just because the technology is moving so quickly. And it's possible that the rest of the car wears out before the battery gives out. And so you might actually want to get rid of the, rusted out bottom or whatever of your vehicle that you've been driving for 300,000 or 350,000 miles. So it's unclear exactly what the end use case will be, but rest assured, these batteries will not end up in the landfill. And at some point after they're totally depleted, they'll most likely be recycled and reused as well. So stay tuned for more information about that. Is the Drive Green program still active if I decide to buy an EV this summer? Absolutely. So car dealerships are starting to open back up again with some restrictions. I'm not sure what the latest is on that, because I haven't been following the phases of reopening as closely, but many dealerships have their sales departments open. There is a bit of a backlog on the inventory of certain electric vehicles, because certain EV manufacturers, like Chevrolet, for example, had to reroute their manufacturing capacity in order to be building ventilators to help hospitals deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are a lot of consumers that are interested and a limited supply of these vehicles, but the Drive Green program is continuing to be active, and we are working with the dealerships that are open and have cars available. And all of that information you can find when you sign up to test drive using the Drive Green portal. But I would say it's probably best to indicate your interest as soon as possible, just in case there is a backlog of people waiting to get their cars from the last couple months, so that you can try and make that purchase as soon as possible, considering the limited inventory. Is the $7,500 federal tax credit on the Bolt still available? Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that that tax credit is not available anymore, because Chevrolet has sold 200,000 electric vehicles since the policy was started. And so that tax credit for the Bolt has been phased out, and they are no longer offering it. I do know that Chevrolet is continuing to offer really great prices on the Bolt in order for the car to continue to compete with some of the similarly sized electric vehicles on the market that still have the tax credit available. So the Hyundai Kona EV, the Kia Niro, and the Nissan Leaf all still have the full tax credit. And so Chevy is doing a good job of continuing to push the car despite that lack of credit, but unfortunately it is not available. If you live in Massachusetts, then the Bolt is still available for that $2,500 state incentive, but the tax credit has ended. And I'll just take one last question because I know it's a couple minutes past the hour and I don't want to take too much of your time, but someone is asking on the opinion of leasing versus buying. This question comes up a lot in the context of, technology is developing really rapidly. Is it worth purchasing an electric vehicle that, may have a much better version of itself be available in just a couple of years? And I would say it depends on the buyer. If you're a person that likes to switch out their cars every couple of years, if you like to have newer technology vehicles, if you are not sure what your driving needs are going to be in a couple of years and you don't want to commit to a car that might not work for you then I would recommend leasing. I know that there are particularly some good deals on leasing because you can't apply for the federal tax credit if you lease. And so usually there are lease prices that kind of take that into account in order to make them a little bit more accessible to consumers. But I think the technology is great as it is, and that if you have a consistent place to charge, if you know what your driving patterns are going to look like in a couple of years, I would say there's no reason not to buy if that's what you would normally do. Okay, and I believe I've answered all the questions here. Thank you for sending those all in. They were really great and engaging questions, but please continue to consider me a resource for any information that you might need about electric cars. I can't say this enough, the Green Energy Consumers website has tons of information, and our blog has lots of interesting information as well as there's a blog version of this webinar that I wrote just a couple of weeks ago. So give that a look if you'd like to review some of the points that I made here today. And I'll also be sending out this recording as well as a copy of the slides either later today or tomorrow as well. So thank you so much for attending. Feel free to send in more questions if you have them. And I appreciate having an hour of your afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day.